What's up, pessimists? So as I'm sure you're aware, it's become a little bit of a cliche in the Trump era for people to say that some of the things we see coming out of this White House would be considered too outlandish for a Hollywood movie, or too far-fetched for an episode of House of Cards. Well, cliches are cliches for a reason, because people say them all the time, and the reason people say them all the time is usually because they're true. And this one happens to be true too, and Trump's emergency declaration just proved it. First, let's look at a little bit of background on national emergency declarations. The general idea behind giving the president the ability to declare a national emergency and seize powers beyond his, or hopefully someday soon her, plain constitutional authority is that when the country faces a crisis, it may require immediate and extraordinary action to be taken to address it. And the normal legislative process may be too slow or cumbersome to effectively handle whatever that situation or crisis may be. So in theory, we allow the president and commander-in-chief the legal space to navigate around the normal process of checks and balances for a period of time. However, such a power grab proved too tantalizing for presidents to resist, and we found ourselves living under dozens of emergency declarations, some completely outdated and some actually acting as the basis for further constitutional violations. So, to address the problem, Congress passed the National Emergencies Act of 1976. It was designed to provide greater oversight and accountability for any emergency declarations that any president may issue. So, by all measures, the law is a pretty big failure. It's achieved no such thing. For example, the law calls for Congress to meet every 6 months to debate the necessity of the existing emergencies and vote on whether or not to end them. And in the 40+ years since the law passed, no such meetings have ever taken place, and most emergency declarations are renewed for years and years on end. We're currently under 30 right now. So tell me if this sounds a little bit familiar to you. An unpopular president so desperate to score a landmark policy achievement before his re-election campaign inappropriately declares a national emergency where one doesn't exist, in order to circumvent Congress's constitutional authority to appropriate funds in an attempt to abuse extraordinary powers to address a completely ordinary issue of public policy. An issue which, by the way, has already been debated and rejected by Congress, including members of the president's own party. Sounds crazy, right? Even a little stupid. Well, it is now, and it was in season 3 of House of Cards when Frank Underwood tried to do the same thing. You know, a lot of people say that Trump's presidency is the reality TV presidency, but it's not even a good reality TV show. He's only like 2 years in and he's already ripping off storylines from other TV shows. So, in the 3rd season of House of Cards, former Vice President Frank Underwood has ascended to the presidency via the previous president's resignation, which happened to be engineered by him and his wife Claire. Because of his ties to the previous administration and because of the fact that he wasn't actually elected president, he has neither the support of the country nor his own party. I don't know. He probably has something like a below 50% approval rating in all of the swing states that he needs to win re-election. In fact, the leaders of his party actually tell him that they don't want him on the ticket at all in the next election.
I will not be seeking the Democratic nomination in 2016.
But his real plan is to use what little time remains in his borrowed presidency to achieve something so grand and spectacular that they have no choice but to put him back on the ticket, and the American people have no choice but to vote for him. So, what does the unpopular and embattled president set out to accomplish? America Works, or AmWorks as he calls it.
I think that once the nation sees AmWorks in action, they will change their attitude.
I'm sorry, AmWorks?
It's basically a guaranteed jobs program that siphons its funding from Social Security. Congress refuses to support it because it's just as big and just as dumb as Trump's stupid fucking wall. The Republicans hate it because they see it as an expansion of the welfare state, and Democrats hate it because it guts funding from Social Security and other entitlement programs. So in order to pay for his America Works program, the president unilaterally extends the definition of a national emergency and declares unemployment to be a national emergency. So Frank's plan is to use money that Congress has allocated to FEMA for natural disaster aid to pay for the first stage of his new program. Now, the funny thing about this House of Cards storyline is that it would be such a blatant abuse of power that the show receives some actual pushback from real-life government agencies. FEMA actually tweeted this out, calling the show out for its unrealistic plotline. They actually received some Twitter hate for spoiling a part of the show. In the end, Frank doesn't use the emergency declaration route because an actual national emergency in the form of a hurricane is on the horizon. Now, a hurricane would be an appropriate use of government emergency funds. But the point is that if the government feels the need to fact-check the constitutionality of a storyline on a TV show, then the actual president probably shouldn't be recycling that storyline in real life as public policy. Now, there are a few differences between the House of Cards storyline and what's happening in real life right now. One, while neither of the national emergencies that Frank or Trump declared are actual national emergencies, Frank's actually does address an urgent issue. At that time in the House of Cards universe, unemployment in the country was at a near record high and was an issue that, while not a national emergency per se, did require urgent attention. On the other hand, Trump's declaration seems based mostly in a desire to fulfill a hollow campaign promise he never expected he'd have to worry about delivering on. I know that because the emergency he talks about at the southern border doesn't exist. Border crossings and arrests are at nearly 50-year lows. Net immigration between us and Mexico is 0. 90% of the drugs coming into the country from Mexico and South America are actually trafficked through legal ports of entry and not the border.
Customs and Border Protection says its officers found 254 pounds of fentanyl, more than twice the previous record seizure. It was discovered in a truck trying to come from Mexico through the border checkpoint in Nogales, Arizona.
Because traffickers prefer the predictability and the routine of the checkpoints that they're already familiar with instead of having to pass through the unforgiving and unpredictable terrain of the actual border. And you don't need to take my word for it because all of those statistics came from Trump's very own government. And the second difference is that while the president in House of Cards tried to take money from FEMA, Donald "Nobody Loves the Military More Than Me" Trump is planning to take money allocated for military readiness and the construction of military compounds, not to mention military pay and military pensions. And oh yeah, money to build a middle school in Kentucky, which newly converted Orange Kool-Aid enthusiast Senator Lindsey Graham is just fine with.
Including construction of a middle school in Kentucky, housing for military families, improvements for bases.
But let's just say for a moment that he took some money out of the military construction budget. I would say it's better for the middle school kids in Kentucky to have a secure border.
The third difference is something we just don't know yet, how this whole thing ends. In House of Cards, that desperate and unpopular president's unconstitutional action died on the vine and he had to find another way to get it done. And FYI, America Works was never really mentioned on the show again. What we don't know is how this desperate and unpopular president's unconstitutional actions will fare. The House of Representatives voted to revoke the declaration, which triggers a mandatory vote of the same kind in the Senate. It looks like it has enough votes to pass the Senate, at which point Trump will either have to give up or veto a bill from Congress for the first time in his presidency. Now, if that happens, they probably don't have enough votes to override a veto for a second shot in Congress. But even if his declaration survives Congress, there's about a dozen or so state attorneys general suing the administration over the declaration's constitutionality. As Trump said,
and we will then be sued, and they will sue us in the Ninth Circuit, and we will possibly get a bad ruling, and then we'll get another bad ruling, and then we'll end up in the Supreme Court, and hopefully we'll get a fair shake, and we'll win in the Supreme Court.
And then we'll all see just how good of a bet Trump made on Kavanaugh's obsequiousness.
I still like beer.
Or to put it like Newt Gingrich,
what about if they subpoena his tax returns?
Then they'll be appealing to the Supreme Court, and we'll see whether or not the Kavanaugh fight was worth it.
Either way, if a TV show so detached from reality that it has congressmen pushing journalists in front of moving trains and murdering fellow congressmen, if a TV show so detached from reality that it has a husband and wife president and vice president who steal elections and literally kill people with their own hands with impunity, if the writers of that TV show decided that a scheme was too unconstitutional, too ridiculous to be pulled off in real life, then maybe that scheme isn't the best idea. Thanks guys for watching this video. Please give it a like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter. Check out my channel for lots of other videos. A new episode of Dear Hillary Rodham is coming out very soon, and I'll see you then.